In this tutorial we will talk about the live macro recorder. Like all the tutorials of this playlist, we will use the notepad just to show that Magic Automa is capable of working with any application. What is live macro recorder? The live macro recorder is nothing more than a recorder of all events that take place on the desktop with mouse and keyboard. Let's see how. I click with the right mouse button. Select Create New Macro with Macro Recorder Live. And then here I have a series of information. I selected Minimize this form during registration. It means that when I execute the registration, this form is minimized and then restored when I press F10. I can also change this key. If you don't want F10 and for you want Ctrl F10. I enter the text box and press Ctrl F10. You see that it is memorized. So from now on, to stop recording the macro we will have to press Ctrl F10. Here we make the form smaller or enlarge. Here we can close the live macro recorder. We start recording by pressing the red button. Memorize the movements I make. I go to the notepad and to start typing I click on the notepad. Then I write a text, I press enter to go to head. We press the key to stop recording. By default it was F10, but we customized it with Ctrl F10, so we hit Ctrl F10. Let's give a name to the macro to be stored. First, click on Next. Let's try to understand these options well because they are important. Live Macro Recorder is a very simple and powerful tool, but it needs to be understood. We have three sections: keyboard, mouse and macro speed. Keyboard section. If we want to reproduce in the macro the keys pressed with the keyboard during the recording of the macro, we must activate this keyboard. Mouse section. If we want to reproduce in the macro the mouse clicks that occurred during the recording, we must activate this option. If we want to reproduce in the macro the movements of the mouse that occurred during the recording of the macro, we activate this macro. Unless you need to show the movements of the mouse, I advise you not to use this option because it slows down the execution of the macro a lot, because during playback it will show all the movements of the mouse. Now we are doing a tutorial, and to show what it does we activate it. Speed of macro section. If we activate this option, the playback of the macro will respect the same times in which the macro was recorded, including the hesitation and waiting times. Generally I have not activated this function because if it takes me 10 seconds to record a macro, the macro will be played in 10 seconds, and I don't want this. Once the macro is recorded, then I want the macro to be fast and accurate. In this case that we are doing a tutorial, activate the option and move on. This is a very important option to understand. If this option is not properly understood, you risk not making the live macro recorder work 100%. If you include mouse clicks in the macro playback, at the end of the macro we must store within the macro if we want the first mouse click to be fixed. First option, then left where the click occurred during the recording. You saw that during the recording I clicked inside the notepad, so if I activate this option I say that I want the first mouse click to take place at that point where I recorded it, but you can well understand that with this option the macro will no longer have any effect if I move the notepad window. Excluded. Second option, therefore the first click of the mouse occurred during the recording of the macro is excluded in playback of the macro. Or variable, options 3, 4, 5 and 6, which we will see later. Click on Save and you see that our first macro has been created. Let's go see the content. The macro has the structure of a macro as if we had created it step by step, but all these steps here because if you remember we have also included the mouse movements. For this reason I exclude the movements of the mouse because they create many lines, and at the end of the macro functionality they are not needed. You see that each line is recorded approximately every 16 milliseconds. Here where you see these commands live mouse up and live mouse down, a click has been made and the coordinates of the mouse position are stored. Where to see live key down and live key up, a key has been pressed. Here I started writing and finished by pressing the enter key. Let's run the macro. For a matter of time I'll show you the final part of the reproduction. You see that it reproduces everything I wrote, also the mistake I made and then I corrected. So as you can see, it reproduced the macro as it was recorded. Now let's create a slightly more complex macro to better understand the first mouse click option. Let's create a new macro with the live macro recorder. Now let's try to make a macro that once an icon on the desktop is selected, the right mouse button is clicked, and the Open File Location option is selected. Let's see how to do it. Click on Start Recorder. Click on the Photoshop icon with the right mouse button. Once the menu is opened with the keyboard, press the down key 3 times to select the desired option and then press Enter. Then we have finished creating the macro, and to stop recording we press F10, or in our case that we have customized this key we press Ctrl F10. The recording stops and we are asked the name we have to give to the macro. Forward. The keyboard section must be included because during the recording of the macro we pressed the down key 3 times, so let's activate it. In the mouse section we only activate the reproduction of mouse clicks because we are not interested in the movements. And in the speed of macro section we do not activate the option because we do not want to reproduce the macro in real time, but we want it to be fast and accurate. Forward. Important option to understand. Then what do I have? Here I pressed a right mouse button, but I pressed it in this position. I realize that the macro in this way, if I leave the first option active, can only work for the icon in that position. If I move the macro or want the macro to work for other macros, so it won't work what we wanted. If I wanted to use this generalized macro for all icons on the desktop, I cannot use the first option, but I have to use a variable option. We said that the first option leaves the mouse click where it was recorded in a fixed position, so in this case it is not good for us because we know we want to make this macro variable. The second option excludes the first mouse click, and in this case it is not good. And the others are variable based on what kind of mouse click we want. In our case it was a right mouse click. So not this one pressing a left mouse click. Not this one that double clicks the mouse. But this one that presses the right mouse button. Then saving the macro. In this way we replace the first mouse click made in a certain position of the screen with a right click of the mouse in a variable position. Who establishes this variable position? Us, by clicking on a point before starting the macro. In this case by selecting the icon on the desktop where we want the right mouse button to be pressed. I show you one important thing. Here we have 4 numbers. The first 2 numbers are the coordinates of the current mouse position. The second numbers, those in brackets, indicate the coordinates of the last mouse click. Then Magic Automa keeps track of mouse movements and mouse clicks. So we said that the values of the last mouse click will be automatically entered in the variable mouse options. First we created a macro at this point. Now let's see if it works in variable points. Click on the After Effects icon and see if the values change. You see that we have clicked and an important value has been stored. Let's try the macro. We see that the right mouse button is clicked in the last point stored and the menu is opened, the down key and the enter key pressed 3 times. The macro works and is perfectly variable. Precisely because we have enabled that option, it has now no longer clicked at the point where the macro was recorded, but at the last point clicked before playing the macro. Let's try another position. You see that the macro is executed correctly. So we see that we no longer have a fixed macro but a variable one. Let's try it on other icons to see if it works correctly. We always observe the numbers in brackets in order to understand that the mouse clicks are memorized correctly. I try to repeat the concept several times because this is a point to understand. If we go now to see the contents of the macro created with the Macrorecorder live, having excluded mouse movements, we can see that it is much easier to understand. In the first line you can see that the first click of the mouse with the right mouse button has been replaced in a variable point that corresponds to the point clicked before running the macro. And then there are instructions for pressing the 3 down keys and the enter key. So you can see that the macro is very simple. It is to understand the first click of the mouse. For any clarification, please do not stop me at the first difficulty for this Macrorecorder. Contact me and I will help you even in private. Thank you.